The morning my daughter drove away from Willow Creek Senior Living, she didn't even turn off the engine. My name is Margaret Whitfield. I'm 72 years old, and for 40 years I taught 3rd grade at Lincoln Elementary in Dayton, Ohio. I raised 2 children in a small brick house on Maple Hollow Road. I clipped coupons. I drove a Buick with 140,000 miles on it. And on a gray Tuesday morning in October, my daughter Rachel helped a nurse carry my suitcase into a room with beige walls and a window that looked out onto a parking lot, and then she hugged me for exactly 4 seconds and said, "This is for the best, Mom." I didn't cry in front of her. I want you to know that. I waited until the door clicked shut, and then I sat on the edge of that stiff hospital bed, and I let myself fall apart, quietly, the way you learn to do when you've spent a lifetime not wanting to be a burden. What none of them knew, not Rachel, not my son David, not their spouses, not a single soul in that family except one person, and I'll get to him, was that 3 years earlier, I had made a decision that would one day turn their entire world upside down. But let me back up, because you deserve to understand how a woman like me ends up abandoned in a place that smells like bleach and canned peas. My husband, Robert, passed away 11 years ago. Heart attack, right there in the garden holding a pair of pruning shears. We'd been married 41 years. After he died, I kept living in our house because it still smelled like him in the mornings, like coffee and cedar. I kept his recliner exactly where it was. I told myself I was fine. David lived 40 minutes away in Columbus, an insurance adjuster, married to a woman named Kelly who always looked at my furniture like she was pricing it for an estate sale. Rachel lived closer, in Kettering, a hygienist with 2 teenagers and a husband, Tom, who golfed every Saturday and rarely said more than 10 words to me at Thanksgiving. For years, the visits got shorter. The phone calls got shorter. And then, about 8 months ago, they got frequent in a way that should have worried me, except I was lonely, and lonely people don't always see clearly. "Mom, have you thought about downsizing?" Rachel asked one Sunday, sliding a glossy brochure across my kitchen table. Willow Creek Senior Living. Smiling, gray-haired models on the cover, holding teacups that had clearly never touched their lips. "I'm not ready for that," I told her. "Nobody's ever ready," she said. "But the house is a lot for you. What if you fell? What if something happened and nobody found you for days?" I noticed David wasn't saying much. He just sat there, turning his coffee mug in slow circles, not meeting my eyes. That should have told me something. David never stayed quiet unless he already knew how the conversation would end. 2 weeks later, Kelly mentioned, almost too casually, over a phone call I hadn't asked for, that a contractor friend of hers had looked at homes just like mine and thought the lot alone could fetch a good price if the market held. I remember standing in my kitchen, holding the phone, feeling something cold settle into my stomach. They weren't asking if I wanted to move. They were already pricing the house. I want to tell you something I never told either of my children. Something I decided the year after Robert died, sitting alone at his funeral reception, watching people I barely knew eat little sandwiches off my good china. I had inherited more than my children ever knew. Robert's older brother, Walter, had never married, never had kids, and had spent 30 years quietly buying small commercial properties around Dayton, laundromats, a strip mall, a self-storage facility off Route 4. When Walter passed 6 years before Robert, he left it all to Robert. Robert never told the kids. He said money changes how people look at you, and he wanted David and Rachel to become who they were going to become before they knew there was anything to inherit. When Robert died, all of it came to me, quietly, through a lawyer named Harold Bennying who had handled Walter's estate and then Robert's, and who was, by that point, the only person on this earth besides me who knew the full truth. I didn't sell it. I didn't flaunt it. I kept living modestly in the same brick house, driving the same Buick, because that's who I was, and because some old, stubborn part of me wanted to see who my children would become without dollar signs hanging over their heads. I learned the answer to that question the day they put me in Willow Creek. The room they gave me was $240 a day. Rachel had signed the paperwork. I remember asking her, gently, "Don't you want to talk to me about this? About what I want?" And she looked at me with something that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite relief, and she said, "Mom, we already talked to a realtor. The house needs work anyway." The house needs work. 41 years of my life reduced to a phrase you'd use about a rental property. For the first few weeks at Willow Creek, I barely left my room. I ate meals alone at a table near the window while other residents played cards or watched television in the common room. A woman named Dorothy, 3 doors down, used to knock on my wall every evening around 7, just so I'd know somebody was still there. She'd lost her husband too. She understood the particular silence that comes after 50 years of not being alone. Rachel visited once that first month. 20 minutes. She talked about her daughter's soccer schedule the entire time. David didn't visit at all. He sent a card. A card for the woman who sat up with him every night for 3 weeks when he had pneumonia as a boy. I called Harold Bennying on a Thursday afternoon, sitting on the edge of my bed with the door closed. "Harold," I said, "I think it's time." "Are you certain, Margaret?" he asked. "Once we start this, there's no quiet way to walk it back." "I've never been more certain of anything," I said. What I asked Harold to do was simple and completely legal, and something I'd actually been planning in pieces for over a year. I asked him to formally transfer full ownership and management of the properties, all of it, the laundromats, the strip mall, the storage facility, worth just over $3 million into a trust. Not a trust for my children. A trust in my name, with very specific, very deliberate terms about who would eventually inherit, and under what conditions. I also asked him to do one more thing: sell the house on Maple Hollow Road. Not because I needed the money, because I needed my children to understand, once and for all, whose name was actually on that deed, and whose decision it had always been. The sale went through in November. A young couple named the Alvarezes bought it, expecting to fix up the kitchen and raise their first baby in the same room where David once broke his arm falling off a bookshelf. I signed the papers in Harold's office, and for the first time in months, I felt something other than sadness. I felt like myself again. Rachel found out about the house being sold before she found out about anything else, because a neighbor mentioned it to Kelly at a grocery store, the way small towns do these things. She called me furious, though I noticed the fury had a strange shape to it, not concern for me, but something closer to panic. "Mom, why didn't you tell us you were selling the house? Who handled that? Did someone take advantage of you?" "No one took advantage of me, Rachel," I said. "I made the decision myself, with my lawyer." "Your lawyer? Since when do you have a lawyer separate from David?" That question told me everything. David wasn't just her brother. He'd apparently positioned himself, in his own mind, as the family's financial gatekeeper, which meant somewhere along the way, my son had started planning around money he didn't know the full truth about. It was David who came to Willow Creek 2 days later, the first visit in over 2 months. He sat across from me in the small visitor's lounge, hands folded, doing his best impression of concern. "Mom, we're worried about you. This isn't like you. First, the nursing home decision goes through fast. Now the house sells without warning. Is there something going on we should know about?" I looked at my son, 44 years old, still wearing the same anxious expression he wore as a boy, whenever he'd broken something and was trying to figure out how much trouble he was in, and I decided it was time. "David," I said, "there's something your father never told you. Something I've kept quiet for 11 years, because I wanted to see who you and your sister would become before you knew about it." I watched his face change as I explained. Uncle Walter's properties, the trust, the $3 million that had quietly existed the entire time they'd been debating whether the $240 a day room was worth it for their aging mother. David went very pale. $3 million, he repeated, like the words didn't fit in his mouth. "Mom, why didn't you ever say anything?" "Because the moment I say something like that, David, people stop seeing me. They start seeing a number." I folded my hands in my lap, and I needed to really know whether my children loved me or loved the idea of what I might leave behind. He didn't have an answer for that. He just sat there, staring at his hands, and for the first time in years I saw something honest cross his face. Shame. Word travels fast in families that are already cracked. By the following week, Rachel showed up unannounced, no appointment, practically running down the hallway of Willow Creek in her work scrubs. "Mom, David told me everything. Why would you let us put you in here if there was?" She stopped, breathing hard, tears already forming. "We would never have sent you here if we'd known." And there it was. The truth, finally spoken out loud, in a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and old carpet. They wouldn't have sent me here if they'd known. Not because it was wrong to abandon your mother in a room with beige walls, but because they hadn't known there was money attached to the decision. "That's exactly why I never told you," I said quietly. "Because you just proved my point, Rachel, without even realizing it." She cried. I let her. I didn't comfort her the way I would have a year earlier, rushing to smooth things over, to make everyone feel better except myself. I simply sat with my hands folded and let the silence do what silence does, force people to hear themselves. Over the following weeks, something shifted, and I want to be honest with you about how slowly and imperfectly it happened, because real life doesn't hand you clean, movie-perfect redemption. David started visiting every Sunday. Not because Harold had told him the trust's conditions included provisions that rewarded consistent, genuine involvement over the next 5 years, though it did, and I'm not naive enough to think that detail didn't cross his mind. But somewhere around the 6th or 7th visit, I noticed he'd stopped checking his watch. He started asking about my former students, about Robert, about things that had nothing to do with money at all. Rachel took an entire Saturday, drove me out to Eastwood Park, and we sat by the lake the way we used to when she was small, back before the golf husband and the mortgage stress and the slow erosion of whatever closeness we'd once had. "I keep thinking about that day I dropped you off," she said, staring at the water. "I told myself it was for your safety, but some part of me just didn't want the responsibility anymore, Mom, and I hate that about myself." I didn't rush to forgive her completely, and I didn't pretend it didn't still hurt. "I appreciate you saying that," I told her. "It matters. But Rachel, trust isn't something you get back with one conversation by a lake. It's something you rebuild one Sunday at a time, same as David's doing." Harold Bennying, ever the careful lawyer, had structured the trust exactly the way I'd asked, nothing rash, nothing designed to punish, just designed to reveal. A portion of the estate would go toward my continued care, wherever I chose to live it out. The rest would be divided between David and Rachel, but released gradually over 5 years, contingent on a simple, almost old-fashioned condition: consistent, documented involvement in my life. Visits, calls, holidays actually spent together, not phoned in from a distance. Some people might call that manipulative. I call it something my own mother used to say: "You don't inherit love, you earn it, generation after generation, the same way you earn everything else worth having." By spring, I moved out of Willow Creek, not because anyone forced me, but because I chose to. I used part of the trust to buy a small condo near the Oregon district in Dayton, close enough that David could stop by after work and Rachel could bring the grandchildren on weekends without a 40-minute drive standing between us. Dorothy, my old neighbor from Willow Creek, moved into an assisted apartment 2 buildings over, and we still have coffee together every Thursday, the same way we used to knock on the wall between our rooms. I saw David and Rachel change in ways I didn't expect. Not perfectly. David still gets that anxious, calculating look sometimes when money comes up, old habits carved deep. But he brings his kids around now, teaches them things Robert used to teach him, fixes things around my condo without being asked. Rachel started therapy, something she mentioned to me almost sheepishly one afternoon, admitting she wanted to understand why she'd been so quick to hand her own mother off to strangers. I think about Robert sometimes, about his decision all those years ago to keep Walter's inheritance quiet, to let our children grow into whoever they were going to become without money clouding the picture. I used to think that was overly cautious of him. Now I understand it was the wisest thing he ever did, because it gave me the clearest possible view of my children's hearts, the version untouched by expectation, by inheritance, by anything except who they actually chose to be when they thought nothing was at stake. I'm 72 years old now, sitting in a condo with a view of a small courtyard instead of a parking lot, and I've learned something I want to leave you with, because I believe it matters more than any of the details about trusts or properties or lawyers. Love that only shows up once it discovers what you're worth was never love for you at all. It was love for what you could provide. Real love, the kind worth having in your final years, in any years, shows up in the room with beige walls before it ever finds out there's anything else in the account. If you have children, or parents, or anyone in your life you've been quietly weighing by what they can offer you, I hope my story gives you pause. Because in the end, the money didn't heal my family. It only revealed what had been true the whole time, hiding underneath the surface, waiting for a reason to show itself. What healed us slowly, imperfectly, one Sunday at a time, was choosing, all of us, to actually show up for each other again. That's the inheritance that matters most. And it's the only one I hope my children remember me for.